It was just past midnight when the rain began to hammer the tin roof of the old duplex in Dayton, Ohio. Grace Evans sat at her kitchen table, shoulders hunched beneath a battered army jacket. The lamp flickered overhead, turning the scattered coins on the tabletop into tiny, quivering moons. Each quarter and nickel had been counted and recounted, hope measured in loose change. Beside the coins lay a stack of unopened bills, another reminder that the world keeps charging rent on grief. Outside, the rain blurred the amber light of the street lamps and turned the world beyond the window into a smear of memories. But the quiet inside the apartment was deeper, heavy with the presence of the one voice she could no longer hear. She ran her thumb over the corner of a faded photograph. Claire, smiling, holding up a ticket stub from a summer jazz festival in Charlotte, both of them much younger. Grace closed her eyes. The ache in her chest had become a kind of rhythm, her only certainty. Atlas watched her from the other room, ears pricked, paws twitching in sleep. Even resting, the German shepherd seemed alert, as if guarding the threshold between sorrow and survival. His coat, slate gray marbled with white, shimmered in the lamplight. Atlas had always sensed things before Grace did. The tremor of an oncoming panic attack. The nights when the loneliness was thick enough to choke her. Tonight, he padded over, laid his head on her lap, and nudged the photograph gently with his nose. Grace let her fingers fall to his head. "I know," she whispered, her voice rough as old gravel. "I know." Atlas, in reply, rose and trotted to the battered side table where a shoebox sat. He nosed it open, pawed out an even older photo, Claire and a small boy, tousle-haired and grinning, eyes shining with mischief. Michael, their son. Or he had been, before words were thrown like stones, before the world split and neither of them knew how to build a bridge back. Grace looked at the pictures, her heart thumping with regret and longing. She pressed her eyes shut. When she opened them, her gaze caught on a tiny blinking ad on her laptop screen. For sale. Historic Pullman railcar needs repair. Rural North Carolina, $4,000 or best offer. A rusted railcar, half buried in kudzu and memories. She should have laughed. Instead, she clicked. For half an hour she scrolled, studied grainy photos, the cracked red paint, the dented brass fixtures. Childhood summers flickered through her mind. Barefoot races by the tracks, her grandfather's tool shed thick with the smell of grease and sawdust, the sound of a train's whistle echoing over Carolina hills. Another wave of despair, sharper this time. Grace stood, moved to the window, watched the rain pool in the street. She should have let the feeling pass, but the thought wouldn't leave. Maybe it was a kind of madness. Or maybe just a final desperate hope. With trembling hands, she picked up the phone and dialed the number in the ad. Her voice sounded thin as she left a message, barely believing her own words. Atlas paced the kitchen, tail low, eyes following her every move. When she hung up, she stared at him. "I can't stay here," she whispered, not sure if she meant the apartment or the city or the sorrow. "I can't do this anymore." Atlas's response was immediate. He padded to the battered duffel bag by the door and nudged it hard. His eyes were bright, expectant. He would not let her leave alone. By dawn, Grace had sold nearly everything. Her wedding ring, her work tools, the last of Claire's records. She packed what little she had left. A folded American flag, 2 photos, a half-empty bottle of migraine pills. Atlas's leash was the last thing she touched. When she clipped it on, he pressed his flank to her leg and stayed there, as if daring the morning to break them apart. They loaded the truck in silence, the sky above swollen and gray. In the rearview mirror, Grace watched the empty apartment disappear behind a sheet of rain. The further they drove, the lighter the world seemed, not in color, but in weight. Each mile peeled away a layer of the city's heaviness, even as it left her exposed. Somewhere on the state line, Grace pulled to the side of the road and sat with the engine idling. Atlas crawled over the seat and nudged his head into her lap, eyes wide and unwavering. "Just you and me now," she murmured, her hand pressed against the curve of his neck. Atlas's tail thumped, slow and certain, as if to say yes, as if to say finally. And so they drove south through the drizzle, toward a future neither could name, a pair of survivors with nothing left but each other and a half-remembered map of hope. The sky over rural North Carolina was a dull pewter the morning Grace and Atlas arrived. The world seemed scrubbed raw, the rain now only a mist that hung above the tangled grass and muddy tire ruts. Grace's truck shuddered to a halt in the clearing, a patch of wild earth circled by tall pine and thick bramble, as if the land itself had grown cautious after so many years of being forgotten. There it was, the Pullman railcar, a long, rust-red ghost hemmed in by briars, paint scabbed and curling, the windows dark and blank. Kudzu wrapped one end like a heavy quilt, swallowing iron and wood in slow green hunger. A crow called from somewhere in the branches, sharp as the feeling in Grace's chest. She stepped out, boots sinking into the mud, breath fogging. Atlas leaped down beside her, tail high, nose to the wind. He circled the truck once, then stopped at the steps leading up to the railcar's sagging door. Grace ran her hand along the cold steel, fingers trembling. For a second she nearly turned back, but Atlas looked over his shoulder, eyes bright, waiting. The door stuck, then gave with a groan. Inside, the air was musty and close, every surface veiled in dust. Moonlight snuck through the cracks, catching on the broken fixtures and shattered glass. Old newspapers curled on the floor, headlines faded to ghosts. Grace let her bag fall with a thud, the echo filling the hollow space. She sat on the battered bench, head in her hands. The last of her energy flickered out, all the bravado of leaving, the strange euphoria of movement gone now. There was just the cold, and the weight of what she'd done. It felt like failure, pure and clean, an old ache she had carried for years. The enormity of her mistake crashed down. This wasn't a new start. It was ruin, wrapped in tin and rot. Atlas hopped up, curled tight against her side. She wept quietly, not for the railcar or the money, but for Claire, for Michael, for every kindness she'd thrown away in her own fear. She wept until the world shrank to the press of a warm body and the steady rhythm of a dog's breath. Atlas licked her tears, patient and undemanding. He didn't look away. He never had. When the cold pressed in deeper, she wiped her eyes and dug through her bag for a blanket, wrapping it around them both. Atlas stretched, jaw cracking in a yawn, then settled, his body a silent promise. Together, they listened to the hush outside. The wind shifting through pine needles, the ache of a world that would not stop turning. Grace's thoughts drifted, broken and blurred. Had she come all this way just to fail again? Had she doomed them both to this emptiness, this regret? Dawn crept in, pale and uncertain. Grace woke shivering, her joints aching from the hard bench. Atlas was already up, nose working at a spot near the back wall. She watched him for a moment, letting the weight of exhaustion dull her nerves. Then he pawed at a loose floorboard, tail wagging with stubborn intent. She knelt beside him, curiosity rising through the fog. With some effort, she pried the board free. Beneath it, in the darkness, something thudded softly. Wood, old metal, and dust. She reached in, heart thumping, and pulled out a battered trunk, hinges rusted but still holding. Atlas watched, eyes alert, as she fumbled with the latch. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and faded handkerchiefs, lay a cache of tools. Wrenches, hammers, a wood-handled screwdriver she remembered from her grandfather's shed. Beside them, a thick, leather-bound notebook, its corners worn smooth. Grace sat back on her heels, hands shaking. She opened the cover and gasped, scrawled on the first page, in her grandfather's looping hand, "For Grace, if you ever find your way home." She flipped through the pages, breath-catching, sketches, blueprints, and scribbled notes on restoration. Each page a quiet conversation between the past and present, as if he'd known she would come looking for something to build from her own broken pieces. Atlas pressed his nose to her knee, then nosed the trunk, eager. The notebook slipped from her fingers, falling open to a folded sheet, a hand-drawn blueprint of the very railcar in which they now sat, annotated with suggestions and reminders. "Start with the frame. Trust your hands. Don't hurry." Grace closed her eyes, overcome by the strange mercy of the find. For months, maybe years, she had drifted, untethered, convinced that the world had moved on without her. Now, for the first time since Claire's death, she felt the thinnest thread of purpose. She ran her fingers along the page, tracing the lines her grandfather had drawn so long ago. Outside, the wind had shifted. Atlas trotted to the door, tail wagging as sunlight crept through the trees. He looked back, expectant. Grace stood, clutching the notebook to her chest. The fear was still there, but it was softened by something quieter. Resolve, maybe, or the memory of every lesson she'd learned and forgotten. Atlas barked once, sharp and hopeful, then bounded into the clearing. Grace followed, the morning brightening around her, the first true light she'd felt in months. They were alone, but not lost. Not anymore. Morning spread across the clearing in slow, silvery bands. For the first time in years, Grace woke to the sound of birdsong instead of city sirens, the railcar's musty shadows lengthening beneath the window's fractured light. Atlas was already awake, nose pressed to the cool pane, tail thumping softly at the sight of a squirrel darting up a pine. Grace sat up stiffly on the bench, the aches in her back and shoulders reminding her of the hard night before. For a long moment she listened to the hush, the distant hum of wind, the flutter of Atlas's breath. Her own heart ticking slowly back towards something like hope. The old trunk, pried open last night, sat beneath the window. She ran her hand across its lid, tools worn soft by time, and the thick notebook, her grandfather's voice on every page. Grace thumbed through sketches and instructions, each one a bridge back to a world she'd nearly forgotten. The scent of engine grease, the rattle of a ratchet, the patient, measured way her grandfather worked. He'd always said fixing things was about paying attention, about noticing the way a bolt turned or a hinge sagged. She rolled up her sleeves. "Let's see what's left of me," she muttered, voice rasped by sleep and memory. Atlas watched her, eyes bright and alert, as she gathered the tools and unlatched the main door. The day began quietly, her breath fogging as she crouched by the frame, Atlas close at her side. She tested the boards, measured the angle of the rusted beams, listened for the brittle crack that meant a piece was lost to rot. It was the kind of labor that called for silence, for patience. Every so often, she'd talk to Atlas as if he were her old friend from the army, or Claire, or even Michael when he was young. She told him about the cities she'd seen, the bridges she'd built, the little victories and bigger failures. Atlas listened the way only dogs do, present, undemanding, his gaze soft as dusk. When she paused, hands trembling from strain, he'd nudge a wrench toward her or sit sentry at the edge of the clearing, scanning the wild woods as if daring the world to interrupt. The days blurred together, sun rising, the smell of sap and damp wood, sweat stinging Grace's eyes. She pried up rotten planks, sanded down rust, patched broken glass with squares of plastic she'd salvaged from the truck. Each evening she'd slump on the steps, dust coating her jeans, hands raw, but feeling just a little like herself again. The nights were still long. Sometimes the sorrow crept back, settling in her chest like a bruise. She'd sit on the cold metal floor, Atlas pressed against her hip, and talk about Claire, about the arguments and the last days, about Michael's silence and the feeling of missing him before he'd ever truly gone. Atlas never barked, never turned away. Instead, he watched her with those slate-bright eyes, sometimes pressing his nose to her palm or resting his head on her knee, anchoring her when the sadness threatened to swallow the world whole. One afternoon, as Grace was scrubbing grime from a corner bench, she found something half-hidden beneath a warped seat. A family photo, its edges curled, colors faded but faces unmistakable. Herself, much younger, hair wine-tossed and eyes fierce, holding a little boy. Michael at 7, grinning, cheeks smudged with birthday cake. Claire's hand on Grace's shoulder, her smile quiet, steady. Grace's fingers shook as she traced the image. The ache in her chest sharpened. Not just grief, but guilt. 1,000 things unsaid. The walls she'd built when Michael needed her most. She pressed the photo to her lips, feeling the old wounds pulse beneath her ribs. Atlas sat close, watching quietly. Then, as if he understood, he slipped out through the railcar door, returning moments later with a battered rubber ball. Grace recognized it instantly, the faded yellow one she used to throw for Michael in the yard, years and worlds away. Atlas nudged it into her hand, his tail sweeping in a slow arc across the dusty floor. Grace stared at the ball, memories crowding close. The boy's laughter, the dog's wild chase, the quiet evenings when they were all together. For the first time since leaving Ohio, hope flickered, shy, uncertain, but alive. That night, she wrote in the margins of her grandfather's notebook. Day 5. Atlas found Michael's old ball. Maybe I'm the one being rescued. The next days settled into a new rhythm. Grace rose before the sun, her body remembering the discipline of old fieldwork. She and Atlas made breakfast, instant coffee, whatever canned food she could scrounge, and then worked side by side. She spoke less of the past and more of the present. Plans for the railcar, the way light shifted across the old brass fixtures, the first sign of blue sky after a week of rain. The world outside the clearing felt far away, almost unreal. But here, with each screw tightened and board mended, Grace felt something inside her begin to repair as well. She learned the woods by the patterns of bird calls, the scent of honeysuckle drifting on the breeze. She learned to trust the steady thump of Atlas's tail, the soft weight of his head against her shoulder at dusk. Some nights, sleep came easy. Others, she sat awake by the open door, listening to the dark, letting the quiet wrap around her like an old blanket. Sometimes, in that hush, She swore she could hear Claire's laughter, Michael's voice, even her grandfather's patient wisdom. Sometimes, all she heard was Atlas breathing beside her, a simple, living promise that tomorrow would come and that she would not face it alone. By the third week, the days had grown warmer and the air in the clearing smelled of pine sap and damp earth. Every night, the trees trembled with the calls of unseen birds. Mornings came with a hush so complete it made Grace feel like a ghost in someone else's memory. She fell into the work, hands stained with grease and wood dust, mind busy with blueprints and scavenged hardware. The railcar changed, almost imperceptibly at first. A pane of glass scrubbed clean, the corner bench mended, the floorboards shored up one by one. At the end of each day, Grace would lean against the frame, sweat drying on her forehead, and watch the sky pale behind the pines. But even as the car took shape, the past pressed in. The photograph of Michael, smudged and bright, forever young, sat tucked in the tool trunk, a silent question. There was a softness in his face that Grace hadn't seen in years, a kind of hope she'd forgotten how to name. At night, she'd dream of him, sometimes a child again, sometimes older, always just out of reach, walking into the trees with his back to her, never looking back. Atlas watched her with quiet devotion, never far from her side. He learned the rhythms of the days, how Grace worked until her muscles ached, how she sometimes sat for hours at the open railcar door, staring into the woods as if waiting for a sign. He'd bring her things, a dropped glove, a lost screw, a branch chewed into the shape of a question mark. When she wept, he pressed against her side, anchoring her in the world's slow turn. One evening, as the light faded and fireflies drifted through the grass, Grace stood in the doorway, arms folded tight. She'd spent the day repairing the back wall, a patchwork of old lumber and salvaged nails, her hands moving with muscle memory she hadn't trusted in years. Atlas lay at her feet, head resting on his paws, watching the woods. It was the hour when the loneliness felt deepest, when the sky went blue to indigo and the world stilled, holding its breath. She thought of Claire then, the memory sharp and merciless. Claire's laugh, bright as sunlight on water. The way she'd held Grace's face with both hands, steady and unafraid, on that first night in Charlotte. All the things left unsaid, the arguments that never ended, the love they carried like a wound, the regret cut deeper than any loss. How easy it was, in the end, to let silence do the work of goodbye. That night, Grace could not sleep. She lay on the bench, the photograph of Michael pressed to her chest, her breath shallow. The old pain, heavy as stone, rolled through her. Atlas shifted closer, sighing, his body warm against her calf. She sat up, unable to bear the stillness. In the dim lamplight, she leafed through her grandfather's notebook again, searching for some answer. Halfway through, a note in faded pencil caught her eye. Nothing broken stays broken if you're willing to sit with it long enough. You fix the cracks not by hiding them, but by learning where they run. Grace traced the words, her hands shaking. She thought of all the years she'd spent running, from cities, from grief, from the echo of her own mistakes. She looked at Atlas, asleep and safe, the only living thing who'd ever waited out her storms. Before dawn, she rose and walked outside, the ground cold beneath her bare feet. She wandered the edge of the woods, breathing the sharp, green air. There was a beauty in the ache, she realized, a quiet dignity in the simple work of survival. She couldn't bring Claire back, couldn't fix what was lost with Michael. But maybe, just maybe, she could learn to live with the cracks. Atlas found her at sunrise, pressing his nose into her palm, tail wagging with gentle insistence. She knelt in the dew-damp grass and buried her face in his fur, the smell of earth and dog and new beginnings steadying her pulse. They spent that day together, working not to fix, but to mend. Grace loosened her grip on perfection. She left some boards rough, let the light through a patch of glass. She spoke aloud. Memories, apologies, small promises whispered to the quiet air. She told Atlas stories of Michael's first day at school, of the Christmas when they'd nearly burned the house down, of how much she'd wanted to be brave, even when she felt like anything but. Atlas, as always, listened. In the afternoon, he chased a butterfly across the clearing, ears pricked, paws light. Grace laughed, a short, rusty sound, but true. For the first time in years, the sound felt real in her mouth, not like something borrowed or forced. That night, as dusk gathered around the railcar, Grace sat on the steps with Atlas pressed close. The world felt larger, but also kinder, full of broken things mended, of cracks that glimmered in the last light. She knew the grief would return, that the road ahead would be lonely, that she might never fix everything she'd lost. But for now, there was this: the steady presence of a dog, the slow work of healing, the hush of the woods in spring. For now, it was enough. The days settled into a gentle, stubborn rhythm. By now, Grace's hands were rough as tree bark, but the ache in her bones felt clean, a kind of quiet proof that she was still here, still moving forward. Summer's first warm winds swept through the clearing, carrying the scent of crushed clover and distant thunder. Sometimes, the world felt almost gentle again. That afternoon, Grace finished patching the last rotten board at the railcar's entrance. She leaned back, wiping sweat from her brow, and watched Atlas nose through the grass, pausing to dig at a patch of wild violets. She had grown used to the company of silence, and of a dog who never demanded more than presence. Yet sometimes, when dusk came and the first stars blinked awake, a longing pricked at her, a memory of laughter echoing in some far-off room, or the warmth of another's hand in her own. That evening, as she boiled water over the camp stove, rain swept in sudden and hard. Thunder cracked overhead, so close it seemed to shiver the air. Atlas, normally unfazed, slunk beneath the bench, ears pinned, eyes on the railcar's trembling windows. Grace sat down beside him, her hand resting on his back, feeling the old shudders of his rescue dog past. She murmured soft words, not meaning to comfort so much as to fill the hush. The storm pressed against the car, drumming its song of loneliness. Outside, the clearing dissolved into darkness and wet leaves. The world beyond felt infinite and close, as if every tree listened, every shadow remembered. Then, just after midnight, came a sound that did not belong. 3 knocks, soft, measured, on the patched railcar door. Atlas shot up, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Grace's heart stuttered. For a long moment, neither moved. Rain pounded overhead. The knocks came again, tentative but insistent. Grace rose, slow and wary, the old army habits waking in her bones. She pulled on her boots and reached for the heavy wrench she kept by the stove. Atlas pressed against her leg, eyes fixed on the door. She opened it a crack. The lantern's glow spilled out into the rain, illuminating a boy, maybe 12, hair plastered to his forehead, eyes wide and dark as river stones. His jeans were soaked to the knee. He clutched a backpack to his chest, shivering. But his jaw was set in that way only children who have learned not to cry can manage. For a moment, neither spoke. The boy blinked against the light, glancing down at Atlas, whose growl faded to a curious whine. Grace stepped back, leaving the door wide. The boy hesitated, then stepped inside, dripping water on the patched floor. He said nothing, only stared at Grace, half defiant, half afraid. She saw something familiar in the angle of his chin, the way his shoulders squared against the cold. She offered him a towel. He took it, muttering a thanks so quiet it vanished before it hit the air. Grace poured him a cup of tea, hands steady. She didn't ask where he'd come from, not yet. The boy sipped the tea, both hands wrapped around the mug. His fingers trembled with each swallow. Atlas, after a long pause, crept forward and sat at the boy's feet. The dog's tail swept the floor once, twice, then stilled. The boy looked down, his face softening just enough to reveal a flicker of relief. They sat in silence. Outside, the rain slowed to a whisper. Grace watched the boy from the corner of her eye, his thin wrists, the bruises fading on his forearms, the cut on his lip. Not fresh, but not old. She recognized the language of trouble, hunger, exhaustion, the way a child learns to vanish inside himself. She did not push. Instead, she handed him a sandwich, watching him eat with the desperate care of someone rationing hope. Atlas rested his chin on the boy's knee, blinking up at him as if to say, "You're seen. You're safe." Much later, after the storm faded, the boy spoke. "My name's Eli." The words came in a rush, but then he fell quiet again. Grace nodded, saying only, "I'm Grace, that's Atlas." Another long silence. The boy's gaze flicked to the window, as if measuring the distance to the woods, then back to her. His voice was small but sure. "You're not going to send me back?" Grace's chest tightened. She shook her head. "No, Eli. Not tonight." The relief in his posture was almost invisible, a loosening of the shoulders, a breath let out slow. Atlas pressed closer, tail sweeping the floor. Grace, watching them both, felt the world shift, subtle but seismic, a widening of the circle, a new story beginning beneath the patched and battered roof. She rose, fetching a dry blanket and laying it out on the bench. Eli curled up, his back to the room, but his eyes never left Atlas, who lay down beside him, a quiet sentinel against the world's old darkness. Grace sat up late, listening to the rain and the slow, steady breathing of boy and dog. She didn't know what trouble might follow him, what fresh heartbreak lay ahead. But tonight, in the railcar's flickering lamplight, she felt less alone than she had in years. Sometimes, she thought, rescue is just another word for letting someone stay. By morning, the world outside the railcar had softened, the storm's anger spent. Water beaded on every blade of grass, painting the clearing in silver. Birds called from the tangled pine, their song thin but hopeful, as if testing the new day. Grace brewed coffee, the rich scent curling through the small space, mingling with the faint, earthy odor of wet dog and wood dust. Eli woke slow, his face pale against the faded blanket. For a long moment, he watched Atlas sleep, one hand buried in the dog's thick fur, his body pressed close as if drawing warmth from more than the animal's body. The boy's eyes, still wary, still shadowed, flicked to Grace, and for a second, she saw what he might have looked like years ago. Unbroken, unafraid. She didn't ask questions, not about bruises or the cut lip or what had sent him through the storm. The quiet between them was soft as old flannel, unhurried and fragile. Instead, she offered him toast, extra butter, a half-joking warning about Atlas's habit of stealing breakfast if you looked away too long. Eli's mouth quirked, almost a smile, and he ate with the hungry, deliberate focus of someone for whom food was not always a certainty. That morning, Grace worked on the railcar's undercarriage. Eli wandered at the edge of the clearing, Atlas close behind. The two of them moving in a silent choreography, Eli tossing sticks, Atlas retrieving them, sometimes simply walking side by side through the long, wet grass. The dog didn't judge, didn't prod. His presence was an invitation, not a question. Later, Grace watched from the window as the boy crouched beside Atlas near a patch of wild strawberries, his lips moving in a one-sided conversation. He pointed at a cloud, drew something in the dirt. Atlas sat, tail sweeping the ground, listening with that grave attention only dogs and children seem to master. For a moment, Grace felt a pang, fierce and almost unbearable, for her own Michael, for all the times she hadn't listened. The afternoon brought new sounds to the clearing, a car door slamming, voices, too sharp, too close. Atlas sprang up, ears pricked, a low warning rising in his throat. Eli froze, eyes wide with fear that was too old for his years. Grace set her wrench down, wiped her hands on her jeans and stepped outside. Two figures picked their way down the muddy ruts. The first was a woman, mid-30s, hair pulled back under a faded baseball cap. Rain jacket zipped tight. Behind her trailed a man, older, his face lost in the shadow of his hood. Their boots left deep tracks in the soaked ground. The woman spotted Grace first, her expression taut, cautious but not unkind. She stopped a few yards from the railcar, raising her hands in a gesture of peace. "Sorry to come up unannounced. My name's Mara. This is my Uncle Cal." The man nodded, silent, his gaze moving from Grace to Eli and back again. Grace nodded, steady. "You're on private land. Didn't expect visitors." She watched their hands, empty, careful, not threatening. Atlas moved between her and Eli, tail high, body tense but not aggressive. "We're looking for a boy," Mara said quietly, glancing at Eli. "Disappeared last night. His folks, well, they're worried." Her voice was strained, the words not ringing true. Eli's whole body went rigid. Grace felt the pull of her own scars, years of looking the other way, of not asking. She let the silence stretch. The wind shifting through the trees. Atlas pressed closer to Eli. Their shadows merged. Mara's voice softened. "We're not the police, just neighbors. Saw a light here last night. Thought maybe—" Eli's voice was a whisper, sharp with memory. "They're not my folks." No one moved. The clearing pulsed with the hush before a storm breaks, every heart waiting. Cal cleared his throat, speaking for the first time. His voice was rough but gentle. "Eli, your dad? He's sick. He drinks too much." Ain't no secret. Mara here's tried to talk sense into him for years. You don't owe nobody anything you don't want to give, son. The woman closed her eyes, as if bracing against a blow. "We won't force you back," she said. "We just wanted you to know. We see you. You got someplace safe, that's all that matters." Grace felt something shift inside, a release like a door opening to let old pain drift out. She nodded once. "He's safe here, at least for now." Atlas relaxed. The clearing breathed again. Mara turned, her hand brushing Eli's shoulder. Not a grip, just a touch, as if to say what words never could. "We'll let folks know you're all right. You need anything, you come to us. No questions, no judgment." As the two left, Eli watched them go, shoulders hunched but eyes clear. The moment their car disappeared beyond the trees, his knees buckled. Atlas reached him first, steady and warm. Grace followed, knelt in the wet grass beside them. She didn't say it would all be okay. She knew better than that. Instead, she rested her hand on Eli's back and let the silence say what mattered. That night, the three of them sat together in the glow of the camp lantern. Rain tapped soft on the roof, but the railcar felt less like a shelter from the world and more like the beginning of a home. Eli told stories, broken at the edges but true, about the night sky, about the dog who found him, about the way sometimes you don't have to be fixed, only found. Atlas slept with his head against Eli's feet, a soft, unspoken promise that he would stay. Grace, her own scars mapped quietly in the dim light, understood at last. Some things you rescue, some things you simply hold. Days lengthened into the pale gold of late summer, and in the shelter of the railcar, a kind of peace took root, fragile but real, growing in the cracks left by old storms. Grace moved through each day with the quiet purpose of someone who had learned to live alongside her scars. The sound of Atlas's paws on the wood floor, Eli's laughter as he teased wild strawberries from the grass, the rhythm of hammers and saws, all stitched together into something like belonging. The work on the railcar became their shared ritual. Eli helped now, quick to learn and eager for direction, his hands small but clever. Together, they lifted warped boards, scrubbed old brass, mixed paint scavenged from the back of Mara's shed. Atlas supervised, a silent foreman, snuffling the corners for dropped tools or forgotten bolts. The smell of fresh varnish mingled with the green scent of pines and the sweetness of wild mint that grew along the creek's edge. But outside the clearing, life edged closer. News of Eli's whereabouts had trickled through the nearest town, carried on the uncertain breath of small talk and neighborly concern. Some wondered at the strange woman living in the woods. Others whispered stories about the dog who never barked, but always watched. On a morning heavy with mist, Mara returned, a battered pickup crunching to a halt at the clearing's edge. She stepped out, carrying a box of canned peaches, a bag of flour, and a wary smile. "You look less like squatters now," she joked, voice gentler than before. Grace met her at the steps, accepting the groceries with a grateful nod. Eli stayed by the window, his eyes cautious, Atlas pressed tight against his leg. Mara sat for a while, talking quietly with Grace, telling her of the world beyond the trees, of the drought in the next county, the church fundraiser, the mailman's heart attack. All the ordinary sadness and hope of lives continued. She didn't ask about Eli's plans, nor why Grace had chosen to live at the edge of things. Instead, she listened as Grace spoke, halting at first, then with more ease, about the old hurts, about running, about what it meant to try again with nothing but your own hands and a loyal dog. When the sun broke through the clouds, Mara rose. She hugged Grace, brief but fierce. Then, stooping, she looked Eli in the eye. "You're not invisible out here," she said. "You got more people than you think, even when you're sure you don't." She pressed a battered paperback into his palm, a book about stars and wild things, inscribed in looping script. "Keep looking up. It gets lighter." After she left, the world seemed larger. Eli walked down to the stream with Atlas, the book tucked under his arm, his feet bare in the cold water. He didn't say much, but Grace watched the change, a lessening of the flinch in his shoulders, the first hints of trust. Late that afternoon, as they worked to hang a new door on the railcar, a familiar rumble echoed down the rutted track. An old blue sedan pulled in, slow and cautious, as if the driver was uncertain whether to stay or flee. Grace's breath caught. For a long moment she stood frozen, tools dangling from her belt, memories rushing like wind through a broken window. The door opened, and an older man stepped out, gray hair wild, face lined by time and something softer, a half-healed sorrow. He hesitated, then walked toward the railcar, his hands empty, his posture tentative. It was Michael. He looked older, leaner, with a faded army jacket, much like the one Grace still wore. His eyes, her eyes, searched the clearing, landing first on Atlas, then on Eli, and finally on her. No one spoke. Atlas, sensing the tremor beneath the moment, padded forward, tail swaying low, and pressed his head to Michael's knee. The man bent, almost in disbelief, and ran a trembling hand through the dog's fur. Grace didn't trust her voice, so she stepped forward, slow and uncertain. For a heartbeat, the years of silence yawned wide between them, words unsaid, mistakes never mended. Michael looked at her, all those old wounds open in his eyes. But there was no anger, just weariness, and maybe a question. Is it possible even now to begin again? She reached out, unsure, and touched his shoulder. It was awkward and stiff, but it was real. Michael let out a breath that seemed to empty the space between them. "I heard about the boy," he said, voice raw. "He's safe?" Grace nodded. Eli watched, silent as always, but his hand rested on Atlas's back. Atlas, as if knowing he was the bridge between them all, stayed steady. As dusk deepened, Michael joined them at the table, his stories slow and halting at first. Where he'd gone, what he'd lost, what he'd hoped he could still give. Grace didn't press. She listened, her own confessions waiting, rising slow as the evening fog. Later, Eli fell asleep with Atlas curled tight at his side, the paperback open beside him, unread but cherished. Grace and Michael sat outside, sharing the hush, the dark, and the long, uncertain road back. No promises were made that night. No apologies. Not yet. Only a silent agreement, traced in glances and the space between words. This is the work. This is the mending. Sometimes, what comes home to you is not what you expect, but what you most need. August's breath carried the scent of drying grass, of pine warmed by sun and rain. In the clearing, time loosened its grip. What had once felt like a last outpost now pulsed with quiet life. The garden patch Grace started as a way to teach Eli patience now showed shy green shoots, beans curling up sticks, tomatoes round and hard beneath their vines, a little row of sunflowers growing like a promise. Each morning, Eli and Atlas would check for new leaves, counting worms and marveling at ants, the kind of simple magic that children rarely keep for long. Inside the railcar, light poured through clean windows. The patched floors no longer groaned underfoot. Grace and Michael spent hours side by side, hands dusty with work and memories, replacing rusted pipes, painting trim a cheerful yellow. Sometimes their conversation was halting, full of gaps, each sentence a step over broken ground. Sometimes silence filled the space, not heavy but gentle, like a blanket spread between them. They learned to sit together, to let things come in their own time. Michael cooked breakfast on the camp stove, eggs, bacon, hot tea, the smells curling up to the rafters. "You still take your coffee black?" he asked once, and Grace only nodded. remembering the way her father used to joke that cream was for people who didn't trust the world. Eli preferred his tea sweet with milk. Atlas would wait, eyes fixed on Michael, and receive the first bite of toast as if it were ceremony. Neighbors came and went. Mara most often, bringing jam, bolts of old cloth, news from the road. Once, Cal returned with a box of dog biscuits and a new collar for Atlas. People from town began to stop by. The postman's widow with wild strawberries. A boy selling corn from a crate. Their footsteps wore a faint path through the pines, but each visitor was received with care. Some stayed for a cup of coffee. Some, like the preacher's wife, sat in the garden and just listened to Eli talk about the stars. Sometimes the past found its own way in. One evening, as clouds gathered above the tree line, a battered minivan pulled up, engine ticking with heat. A woman stepped out, younger than Grace had expected, her arms bare and strong, hair pulled back in a messy knot. She carried herself with a tired pride that Grace recognized in her own bones. It was Eli's mother. She paused on the edge of the clearing, hands twisting the strap of her purse. Eli saw her first, his body tensed, eyes wide and uncertain. Grace set down her tools, heart pounding in the hush. Michael stepped forward, but it was Atlas who broke the silence, trotting over, tail wagging, a bridge between sorrow and hope. The woman's name was Trina. Her voice was soft, worn thin by too many years of holding the world together on her own. "Eli," she whispered. The boy hesitated, then ran to her, burying his face in her waist. They stood that way a long time, swaying gently as if rocked by the wind. Grace turned away, blinking hard. Trina stayed that night. Grace made space, laying out blankets, heating soup. Trina helped Eli wash the garden dirt from his feet, humming a lullaby too quiet for words. Michael played cards at the table with Grace, their movements easy, familiar, the way family used to be. That night, as rain spattered the roof, Trina sat with Grace beneath the porch light. "He's better here," Trina said simply, her hands folded tight. "I can't promise what his father will be, but if you'd let him, I'd like Eli to come back sometimes, just to know he's not alone." Grace nodded. She could not find words, but her hand closed over Trina's, rough and sure, and held on. There was nothing to fix, only to witness, only to be present for the choosing. Over the next days, Trina lingered, helping in the garden, showing Eli how to braid grass, teaching Atlas new tricks with scraps of biscuit. She and Grace worked in companionable quiet, sharing the careful dance of women who have learned to survive. They didn't swap stories of heartbreak. Instead, they traded seeds, recipes, advice about the best way to keep deer from trampling the beans. When Trina left, it was with the promise of return, and with a hug for Eli that left him standing in the sunlight, dazed but smiling. Atlas nudged his shoulder, and for the first time since that night in the rain, Eli laughed without looking back over his shoulder. As summer deepened, the railcar felt less like a refuge and more like a beginning. Michael planted a row of wildflowers at the edge of the clearing. Mara brought a battered telescope, and Eli and Grace took turns searching for the moon's craters. They played cards and read aloud, built a birdhouse from scrap wood. Sometimes, in the dark before sleep, Grace listened to the breathing of those around her and thought, quietly, that maybe healing was not about mending what was broken, but tending to what remained. Sometimes she let herself believe that what they kept here, laughter, trust, the silent loyalty of a dog, was enough to fill the empty spaces, enough to begin again. By September, The railcar and the clearing had settled into their own gentle pulse. The garden was wild with beans and tomatoes now, sunflowers taller than Eli, and bursts of orange zinnias at the door. Afternoons stretched lazy and long, filled with the quiet business of living, repairing a fence, baking bread, washing soil from fingernails, listening to the distant call of an owl at dusk. With Trina coming and going, sometimes Eli stayed a few days with her, sometimes with Grace and Michael. The transitions were gentle, never forced, never final. Atlas padded easily between households, his loyalty unbroken, always returning to sleep at the foot of Eli's bed. On nights Eli was away, Atlas would curl beside Grace or sprawl at the end of the porch, nose pointed to the wind, waiting. Michael stayed on, fitting into the rhythms of the place like a note in a half-remembered song. He fixed the truck, taught Eli to sharpen a pocket knife, mended the old rain barrel. Sometimes, in the evening, he'd sit outside with Grace, not talking about the years that split them apart, but resting in the shared hush of forgiveness. Grace never asked why he'd left, and Michael never asked what it cost her to wait. There was an understanding between them, a respect for old pain, a tenderness for what remained. One gray morning, a letter arrived, tucked into a jar of blackberry preserves at the door. It was from the county, official notice about the land, a reminder of taxes owed, a threat softened by bureaucratic language. Grace read it over coffee, her mouth a thin line, her heart heavy with the familiar dread of what could be lost just when it began to matter. She took the news quietly to Michael, who sat in silence a long while before folding the letter and tucking it into his shirt pocket. "We'll find a way," he said, voice steady. "I'm tired of running from what's ours." Grace nodded, but the worry lingered, a thin, persistent ache beneath the comfort of daily life. That night, after Eli had gone to sleep, Grace stood on the porch with Atlas, watching the last fireflies blink out among the pines. Her mind churned with numbers and possibilities, the weight of choices pressing against her chest. She thought about the past, the years spent holding tight to hurt, the mistakes never spoken, the words left unsaid between her and Claire, between her and Michael, between herself and her own younger, braver self. Atlas pressed his head into her thigh, as if to anchor her. She knelt, burying her hands in his thick fur. The stars above spun slow, and she realized how much of her life had been spent chasing what was gone, missing the quiet gifts that remained. She didn't pray, not really, but she spoke softly into the hush. "I wish I'd said yes more. I wish I'd listened better. I wish I hadn't waited so long to come home." Atlas only blinked, warm and alive beneath her hand. In the following days, the weight of the letter softened, reshaped by the care of those who shared it. Mara organized a yard sale, neighbors donating old tools, books, clothes. Michael sold handmade birdhouses at the farmer's market, his quiet pride blooming in the small things built well. Trina brought baked goods and a basket of jams to town, her laughter ringing in the store as she traded stories for change. Eli painted a sign, "Save our Railcar," and stood on the roadside with Atlas at his feet, waving at every passing car. They did not raise all they needed. But people came. The postman, the preacher, the school teacher with a faded blue scarf. They bought bread, gave what they could, offered small kindnesses that added up to something more than money. A sense that the clearing belonged not just to Grace, but to all who'd been lost and found beneath its pines. One evening, after the sale, Grace sat with Mara by the garden. The sky glowed violet at the edges, and the air was thick with the scent of basil and earth. Mara handed her a mug of tea, her hands strong and calloused. "You ever wonder if it's worth it?" Grace asked, voice low. Mara's smile was soft, a little sad. "Every day. And then I remember. It's not about fixing the world, just about not giving up on your own patch of it." Grace nodded, tears gathering without warning. Mara didn't flinch, just reached over and squeezed her hand. As autumn crept closer, Grace noticed the ways her heart had changed. She spoke more gently, listened longer, let herself be held by the small mercies of her chosen family. Some nights Michael read aloud on the porch, while Eli and Atlas drifted in and out of sleep, the old railcar aglow with lamplight and laughter. But still, the ache of what she hadn't said to Claire, to Michael, to herself, sometimes pressed close. There would always be shadows, always some loss that could not be mended. Yet here, in the hush between breaths, she learned that some things need not be spoken to be known. That night, as the first leaves turned gold at the edge of the woods, Grace found Eli standing in the garden, Atlas beside him. The boy pointed up. "Look, shooting star." And in the streak of light across the dark, Grace let herself believe for a moment that what was left unspoken might finally, gently, set them free. Autumn came in slow and kind, the world around the railcar softening at its edges. The pines shed their sharpness for a golden dusk, and each evening, the sun spilled through the patched windows, catching dust motes in the air, lighting everything in honey. The work of saving the land, of mending old wounds, continued in quiet, everyday ways. On Sundays, the clearing filled with the small, gentle chaos of community. Mara's laughter echoing from the porch, Trina hanging bright scarves from the line, Michael whittling shapes for Eli by the steps. Neighbors brought baskets of apples and jars of pickles. Donations pressed quietly into Grace's hands. A little extra here, a paid-off bill there. A promise that nobody was alone in this place if they didn't want to be. Grace felt it in her bones. The slow coming home, not only for her, but for everyone who gathered here. It was in the way Mara let herself rest in the garden, the way Michael and Eli fell into fits of laughter over a crooked birdhouse, the way Atlas circled them all, always alert, always present. A sentinel for this new world built not from blood, but from choice. Inside, the railcar had become a place where every scar and scratch was part of the story. Grace sometimes ran her hand along the grain of the old boards, feeling the seams, the stubborn knots that held against every storm. She thought of all that had passed through here, her own grief and shame, Michael's wandering, Eli's bruised hope, Trina's worn-out prayers. The walls held it all without judgment. One night, as rain drummed soft on the roof and the wind shook loose the first yellow leaves, Grace stood in the doorway and watched Eli and Atlas in the circle of lantern light. Eli was teaching Atlas to shake, the dog's big paw pressed into the boy's small hand, each of them grinning, the air thick with patience and pride. Trina watched from the bench, her face open and quiet. Michael sat behind her, plucking a slow tune from an old guitar, notes floating into the dark. For a long while, Grace did not move. She let herself listen, heart open to the hum of togetherness, a family built not from the easy comfort of similarity, but from the hard, good work of letting people in. After dinner, they shared slices of apple pie, passing plates around until every crumb was gone. The talk drifted from the price of firewood to the coming frost, to a half-remembered song Trina used to sing for Eli, her voice soft and a little off-key. Mara told a story about her mother's dog, who once rescued a kitten from a pond and then refused to give it up, even when the cat grew old and cranky. As the night stretched on, the grown-ups gathered by the stove, voices low. Grace looked from face to face, Mara's gentle strength, Trina's tired eyes filled with hope, Michael's stubborn softness, Eli's quiet trust. Even Atlas, sprawled in the middle of it all, belonged to everyone and to himself. Grace poured coffee for Michael, tea for Trina, and let herself lean into the warm, ordinary closeness. In the soft, lamp-lit hush, she finally let go of old fears, the fear of not doing enough, of losing what little she had built, of being seen as broken or needing too much. She realized suddenly that she had been loved through every loss, and that forgiveness, of herself, of others, was not a single act, but a daily choosing, a steady, living practice. Later, as the others drifted off to bed, Grace lingered at the window. The moon rode high, the clearing painted in silver and black. She watched the shadows shifting, Atlas lifting his head, Eli whispering goodnight, Michael's silhouette framed in the door. She thought of Claire, gone but never truly absent, her memory living in the hands that built, in the hearts that stayed. In the stillness, Grace took up her grandfather's old notebook, now filled with her own sketches and small triumphs. She wrote, "Tonight, the railcar is full. Not just with people, but with every scar and every act of care. I am not waiting to be fixed. I am learning, at last, to stay." She closed the book and set it down. Atlas moved to her side, his head heavy against her knee, and she stroked his fur in the golden lamplight. She did not need to speak the words aloud. Everything she felt was there in the hush, the gratitude, the peace, the sorrow, and the bright thread of hope that ran through it all. Outside, the wind bent the tall grass. Inside, the light from the stove flickered against the walls. Grace breathed in, slow and sure, and let the world be as it was, unfinished, beautiful, and whole in its broken places.